I'm Whitney Tilson. I hope you enjoy this video. If you'd like to learn more about Kase Learning and our programs, just go to kaselearning.com. And if you have any questions, just email me at info@kaselearning.com. That's a nice picture of you.
Whatever you want. Whatever makes you
There you
happy.
go.
First of all, thanks to Whitney and for Kase for having me present in front of you today. I know they always say in like show business, never follow a dog or kids. I'm a little confused what to do in following a clip from The Hangover. So I was starting to think about how to discuss some of the concepts Whitney had wanted me to present upon. And while some of it you wanted me to focus on insider trading, and that is relevant in the short time frame, I don't think I can do certain subjects justice. And there's a lot of information or activity that short sellers often sometimes lose sight of. So I'm going to start off with discovering the story. As each of you comes upon the information that you want to act on, that's actionable, you might hear it through a verbal conversation. You may read about it. Somebody might send you a document, or it might be through some form of public dissemination, a 10K or 10Q. The first thing you should be considering doing is assessing whether this information is material public information. I'm going to refer to the acronym M NPI. It's one of those things, when you see it, you know it, but it's a scale. And so while you think it's sometimes very clear when it's M NPI, in many cases, it's not always that clear. And I've worked on several short activist campaigns with clients. And the first line of defense usually is, how do you determine this M NPI? I would always recommend start it with a phone call with your legal counsel rather than emailing the facts, because the way you might even write the facts might be damning in and of themselves. So start it with a conversation and articulate what you know and how you know, and then determine the next actionable items per se. For example, if you hear good news on the other end of the phone or in the meeting, how do you memorialize the conversation via email or memorandum? God bless you. So I learn a lot of times through stories. And while it seems really clear what MNPI is or isn't, we had an experience with a client where he sent an analyst to go take a phone call or do a meeting with a company. Analyst took notes, does the download with the PM. PM trades on it. Short while later, SEC is knocking on the door, alleging that they've engaged in trading while in possession of material non-public information. A couple of years later, the analyst and the PM are exonerated, but it comes at an opportunity cost economically, and at times it takes away your attention from your primary businesses. The other thing I've learned from my experience with some of the people that have been in the room is it's not just the one point of contact, it is dynamic. So it might be my initial conversation is going to have a whole set of facts that led to that moment in time. But once the short is put on the position, if they're getting loud, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, they're still receiving information from either employees, insiders, third parties, and it's still important to determine whether the regulatory risk that you might be exposed to has changed by virtue of the dynamic data coming in. So we try to assess MNPI step one, and then the next component is documenting and substantiating the information. If you're engaged in a proprietary trade, you may want to document it for purposes of reducing any regulatory risk you might have for somebody alleging in the future, a year or 2 years later, that you engage in inappropriate behavior. But for those of you in the room that are managing other people's money, it serves to also protect you from other obligations you may have by managing third-party capital. So we get into this. The next thing is you're going to go and put on the trade when you feel that your conviction level for this investment position is substantiated. And then it comes down to, do we get short and get loud, or light touch from coming and speaking at a conference? In any event, whether you're tweeting, whether you're using social media, whether you're doing an interview, whether you're publishing a white paper, it's important that when you think it's final, or when you've articulated the final message, same thing. And I know it seems self-serving, But the reality is, when you don't do that and things go wrong, the lawyers end up sometimes unable to fix the problem, and the cost of the fix, if it's even feasible, is far more high-priced. And you look at Leon Cooperman by way of example, and I'm not suggesting he did anything wrong or that he didn't. And whether you think he won or he lost, he settled at $5 million. It took a while, a little less than $5 million. And I don't even know the full costs of what he went through, opportunity cost and economic cost. So you put on the position, and whether you, like I said, you decide whether you're going to get loud or light touch, you want to make sure somebody has reviewed it and been an arbiter to reduce your likelihood for any claims of slander, libel, or some other fraud on the markets. Now, the question that Whitney had wanted me to focus on was whether it's a shenanigan or a fraud. Do you report it to a regulator? Who? And how do you go about doing it? On the do side, that's really up to you whether it fits into your playbook of how you've conducted yourself or the size of whatever it is you believe you've uncovered. As Whitney also said, I used to be with the enforcement division of the SEC here in New York. So while I have a bias towards working with the SEC, it's fundamentally who your lawyer or who you might have a relationship with. But as you all know, regulators don't seem to have a soft spot in their hearts for short sellers. But my advice has been engage counsel. You engage counsel for a whole host of reasons. One, to protect you from yourself. You may say things in verbal communications or written communications. You may want to maintain some sort of anonymity if you haven't gone loud yet. The other thing, it would appear that you've taken more consideration to have engaged counsel because we're going to go through the information because we're not parrots. We're not going to put our reputation at risk if you're out there engaging in some sort of scheme. Scheme in the American sense, not the British sense. So with regard to then the when, my experience has been on the when. We tend to have gone to regulators before the short seller has gone public. It seems even more inappropriately motivated, I think, after you've gotten loud to go to the regulators. It's also nice to give them a head start. My experience has been in my conversations initially with the SEC, prior to providing them any documentation or information, was that I would explain to them, this is what we're doing. My client uncovered this. In several of the instances, the client maintained anonymity initially. We're going to go to the press in a week, 2 weeks, whatever the timing worked for our client. And we're going to give you a head start, and if asked, we're going to communicate that we've at least made every attempt to inform the regulator. Now, another avenue, which I have not seen any short sellers go by, but it came up in a conversation with Whitney, was with regard to whistleblowing. And I presume most of you have not engaged in any whistleblowing. My experience has been that's been more for employees of companies who tried to resolve their issues with the companies. But due to Dodd-Frank, that got enacted in 2010, the rules regarding whistleblowing and the protection of whistleblowers was codified. And whistleblowers, from a statutory perspective, on any judgments in excess of $1 million, are entitled to a minimum of 10%, a maximum of 30% of the damages of recovery. You can do it anonymously. The statute requires if you did it anonymously that you're required to engage counsel, and legal counsel works with the government. But prior to claiming your award, you lose your anonymity. The areas of risk that I've seen, that's usually what you want to hear about from my perspective, is you have an idea. You start to broadcast this idea, whether it's at an event like this, whether it's an interview on CNBC, whether it's a white paper. You're going to have more points of contact possibly coming in, positive and negative. I was reading an interview by Carson Block that he was saying, basically, if you uncover a fraud, the company that's engaged in the fraud, they're not going to all of a sudden say, okay, you caught me. They're going to go and they're going to defend their fraud, and they're going to go to the media more. We found from experience that when you have a short campaign against an issuer, they're either going to go to a local politician, they're going to go to a regulator, and soon enough, you may get a request, an inquiry, an informal inquiry. You may get other points of contact from either an attorney general in your state or the SEC. And that's where the substantiation of the information you have comes into play to protect you. That's where you've tried to validate every point of contact, whether it's with a corporate insider. And I don't know if any of you got the luxury of catching Whitney on 60 Minutes with Lumber Liquidators. I remember Whitney was calling me at various hours in dealing with this to make sure that he was not in possession of material non-public information. I don't think it's a breach of attorney-client privilege. And I apologize, but I'm pretty sure it's not. So we've played it safe along the way as we've worked together, and it's been very common among other short sellers. And if you had said to limit it originally to 10 minutes, I don't want to overstay my welcome. But one or two more areas of risk. As you communicate with other short sellers, you've got to be very, very careful so it doesn't appear that you're engaging in a manipulation of the marketplace. So everything you put in writing, assume it's going to be found out. Everything you put on the internet, somebody will be able to recreate it, and you're going to be asked questions. Even if you have verbal conversations with those people, they may then send emails that, whether you realize it or not, might connect the two of you. So that's something else to be very cognizant of, how you interact with each other once you're involved in a shorting position.
Questions for Ron? He's not charging his usual rates here to answer your questions, so you can ask. Go ahead, right up here, microphone.
And I would add one more thing. For those of you that are running funds or dealing with third-party capital, how you go about communicating with your investors, that's going to require some analysis. We had a recent issue, something we had to analyze for an activist on valuing their portfolio that wasn't, they said, fairly reflected in the marketplace on the valuation. So there's tertiary issues that do arise, and then the liquidity features of the products you manage, whether it matches the duration of the short, and then finally, if your short actually goes to zero, can you cover the short before it gets to zero so that you don't have the brokerage firm forever charging you some sort of rate of return on the borrow?
Mm-hmm. Yes, go ahead.
The rule on M NPI, does that apply across the board regardless of whether you're a fund manager?
Yeah, while you're maintaining material non-public information, yes. It doesn't matter whether you're managing money for third parties or its own proprietary capital. It's generally if you have possession of information in breach of a fiduciary duty owed. There was the Newman case that came out where it said that the tipper had to have some pecuniary benefit. You would think that would have cleared things up. And I would argue it doesn't clear things up. Everything is very, very fact specific. And in many cases, what I find our clients will articulate as facts, it's like there might be two sides or three sides to every story. Even if you're articulating it correctly, you might have a counterparty on the phone that remembers it differently. So sometimes taking notes contemporaneously with your communications serves to protect you.
Yeah.
And by the way, think of like Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart wasn't running money for anybody else. The accusation was, she, I believe, heard it from her broker. And I think one of the issues was lying to the government as opposed to whether it was the actual violation.
Yeah, it's an important thing. If you ever do get, it's been quite a while, fortunately, but if you ever do get called in, I remember sitting next to Ron when Eliot Spitzer's team, it wasn't him directly, but his people were trying to nail me in the context of Bill Ackman, David Einhorn, and me manipulating the stocks of MBIA and Farmer Mac. This was back in the early days where you could count on one hand the number of activist short campaigns. They weren't even really campaigns, but activists, anyone who spoke up about a short idea was absolutely unheard of 15 years ago. There have been more activist shortings taking place at this conference than took place in 5 years back then. And so the companies would cry foul, the regulators would get called in, and they made our lives miserable. And I still remember the advice, we weren't supposed to speak with one another, but Bill's a good friend, and we talked, and he said, Whitney, whatever you do, tell the truth, because I'm going to tell the truth, and our stories had better match up. which is pretty good advice. And when I told that to the regulators, they almost fell over because they thought we were this nefarious, cabal of short sellers, and they thought we'd be lying to them. And that's what I'm glad you brought up Martha Stewart, because Martha Stewart went to jail, and not because of the trade, it's because she was embarrassed about it, and she lied to regulators about it. So that's a huge no-no, as you will.
Yeah, and it's surprising that you would think people would lie. We had a client that was painting the tape, basically doing the last trade every day. They were turned in by their prime broker, and from my perspective, the SEC had them dead to rights. The only thing I told them is, look, I can't tell you how this is going to turn out, but if you lie, then you risk jail time. And that would be the worst result. The worst result, if you're honest, isn't as bad as that. And so they didn't lie, and ended up being the SEC just went away, which I found surprising, and it worked out very, very well.
They were probably so shocked. Hedge fund manager telling us the truth.
But I've sat in testimony of clients where you don't know the emails that are being sent by your counterparties. And you'll be, if God forbid you're pulled into a room and you're under these bright lights and you have a little microphone right in front of your face and everybody's staring at you, they're going to slip pieces of paper in front of you you've never seen. And they're going to ask you who the people are, how do you know them, what did you communicate about them, and you know this is one of 20 more emails you're going to see. So and when I was saying run things past your counsel, it seems very common sense. We're talking about written slides maybe, or white papers you might be putting out in the marketplace. But you wouldn't necessarily think from a common sense perspective, well, I'm going to talk for 10 minutes on a subject. How do I really run that past my counsel? You create an outline of your talking points, and you talk it through with them. And at the very least, you're going to benefit because it's going to remediate any risk you might be subject to.
Let me tell you two brief stories. Well, when I brought the lumber liquidator story to 60 Minutes, I told them, I brought them the confidential, the person who brought me the information about the formaldehyde in the laminate flooring. I brought it to 60 Minutes, and I knew that if 60 Minutes broke the story, the company might well sue us. And I wanted to make sure there wasn't a paper trail. So I just told 60 Minutes, don't tell me what you're doing. Let's not exchange any emails. But we weren't even on the phone. Like, we just cut off communication. I brought them the story, and I cut off communication for 5 months. And then they aired the story, and I was pleased and delighted, but completely surprised by what was in the story. I was shocked that I did not get sued by lumber liquidators. They certainly threatened to do so. The chairman of lumber liquidators went on national television the day after the story broke and said, quote, 60 Minutes made up this story. And that Whitney Tilson is a lying short seller just trying to profit from the demise of our stock. So I fully expected a lawsuit to follow, but there wasn't going to be anything to turn over. And I still remember Eliot Spitzer in a room like this full of hedge fund guys when he was at the top of his power. And he said, I just want to thank all of you for all the emails you send. And everybody sort of cracked up. There was sort of nervous laughter. But he was like, you guys are creating a paper trail that makes my life really easy to nail you guys, right? So just be smart about that. Understand that, particularly on the short side, that there's every possibility of either getting subpoenaed or deposed either by the company in a private action or by regulators. And just don't be stupid about what you put in writing, and try and make your life easier such that there's not huge amounts of stuff you have to turn over.
Yeah, you would think even with Twitter, and I'm not trying to be funny given Elon Musk's tweet,
Yeah.
and probably most of you, like me, were scratching your head saying, what were you thinking? What is the upside? We all have to own our language and our words, and we have to think through how we're going about communicating, especially when it comes to this subject matter.
Yeah, I'll give you one other story. There was a tiny little company. We owned 5% of it, and they were trying to take the company private. Management owned 2/3 of the company. They were trying to take it private at $3 a share, and there was an external offer on the table at $4.50 a share. But they wanted to steal the company for themselves, so they were trying to use their controlling position to steal the company at a way below market price. So we sued to block. I ended up getting hit with a defamation lawsuit by the company because I emailed Glenn. I didn't write an article, I didn't talk to the media, it didn't go public. I wrote an email to Glenn saying, quote, "Are these guys the biggest crooks on the planet or what?" Question mark. And I sent it to Glenn, and that came up in my email discovery. Of course, he was my business partner. Just an internal email between the two of us. So, of course, it was the most ridiculous, frivolous lawsuit in the history of the world. I can't have defamed them in an email that never went public between two business partners, right? But they used that to concoct a lawsuit. It cost me $100,000 to make that lawsuit go away. It was dismissed with prejudice under the California SLAPP laws, but it still cost me $100,000. $100,000. Because I was careless in an internal email to my partner, right? So
I wouldn't even call that careless because it defies common sense.
Yeah.
While some of the things I'm saying seem obvious on their face, it's amazing how many people don't follow these simple rules. It's like the rules you learn as a child in a sandbox. These are the rules you should be learning in playing in the sandbox of short selling.
Yeah, it's not just short selling, activism in general. Anytime you are going up against somebody else, a company, long or short, activist long or short, assume that every single thing you put in writing or record will be turned over to your enemies, and they can pick out the stupidest thing, the most irrelevant thing, and use it to just torture you. So don't give them any ammunition. So how about on that note? Thank you, Ron.
Thanks.
All right. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, if you'd like to learn more about Kase Learning and our programs, just go to kaselearning.com. And if you have any questions, email me at info@kaselearning.com. Thank you.